And welcome back to the Flights of Fancy podcast, where we talk about military aviation, past, present, and presumably future. Today, we've got an interesting episode. It's going to be one of the longer episodes that we've ever done, which I guess, considering it's a third, is kind of the way it'll go. There's a lot to talk about, so hopefully we'll be able to get everything covered. As always, I'm Mr. O. With me as my co-host is Mr. X.
Hey.
And today's episode is about the Curtiss SB2C Helldiver. Now, as mentioned before, there's a lot to talk about. Primarily, we should talk about the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company, although technically that became later on the Curtiss Wright Corporation, and subsequently had a merger with became a subsidiary of a larger corporation. As one might expect, the Curtiss Wright Corporation was a merger between Curtiss, as we see the logo here, but also of the Wright Aeronautical Company in 1929. It was created in 1916 in New York. In order to take advantage of large military orders being placed due to the ongoing war in Europe, aka World War I. Which makes sense. At the time, aircraft was kind of a new thing, and everybody was willing to throw money at any company that was willing to provide them with a solution to the new paradigm, quote unquote, of combat in general. So, with regards to the Curtiss Company, it was founded by Glenn Hammond Curtiss, who had already been an active part in the aeronautical world. He had first worked with Alexander Graham Bell and in the Aerial Experiment Association in 1907, and started his own company in 1909 called the Herring Curtiss Company. That would soon get renamed to the Curtiss Aeroplane Company itself. Now, for Mr. Curtiss, as seen here, he himself was born in 1878 in Hammondsport, New York, and grew up with no formal training in aeronautics or engineering. He, like it seems many others of his day, just had a sort of natural talent to learn from multiple different common or similar areas of design, and sort of be able to apply that into the new field of aeronautics, or just developing engineering fields. He managed to find work as a telegraph messenger for Western Union when he was 12, formed the basis of his knowledge with regards to communications. He ended up developing his own communication system, due in part to that, or largely in part to that, I should say. A later job with the Eastman Kodak Company actually is what gave him a great appreciation and respect for cameras. I believe it's mentioned in several of the different books that I've read that detail a lot about either Mr. Curtiss himself or his company, and companies, I guess. But it seems that the Curtiss Company, or Curtiss himself, has a lot more photos of his designs, even if some of the design paperwork does not exist anymore. Photos still do, which accurately, or to a certain degree, accurately represent their different sizes and ratios, so that while the exact documentation and details don't necessarily exist, reconstructions can still happen due to those photos. And so it actually fills a kind of a niche area within early aviation to be able to have all those photos of flying machines of the time. Now, with regards to his work prior to aeronautics, he soon after the Kodak Company work, he in 1897 worked in a bicycle repair shop, I believe back in his hometown, and he would eventually build his own motorcycle with his own proprietary one-cylinder engine. So kind of gives you an idea as to how much of a um, uh, mechanic or mechanical engineer he was, that he can design all these things and have them work out to be rather successful. His work on motorcycles would find him in the company of a balloonist by the name of Thomas Scott Baldwin. Now, Baldwin himself is a circus acrobat who turned to balloons for his spectacles. Basically, the kind of new hip thing to do, and to sort of punch up his displays. Now, he and Mr. Curtiss both worked together over a number of years. I believe there was a conversation via Telegram that they had together because Mr. Baldwin had seen a notice about Mr. Curtiss and his engines, and he wanted to apply both together, so that not only would you just have balloons, but you could have dirigibles, or dirigibles, however you pronounce it, effectively moving balloons, the precursor to aviation, or aviation as we know it in terms of combat aircraft or planes in general. Now the pair of the two worked together on the first dirigible, and it was actually their work, along with performing tests for the U.S. Army, that actually became the first purchase of an aircraft. I believe in the U.S. Army, not specifically the world, but everywhere I've seen it defined doesn't really mention if it's world or just the U.S. Army. Regardless, it is a rather famous position to find yourself in, to be the first of a large group of men, women, and other people who have produced works for either the U.S. Army, armies in general, or the world at large. Now, this acquired fame, along with all of his other talents that he managed to either acquire or promote, would be his entry ticket into the aforementioned Aerial Experiment Association. Now, the purpose of the AEA, as it was known, was to develop aircraft. These were initially called aerodromes. Not quite sure why they ever came up with that name, but it seemed to have been what it was called at the time. And the reason why they came together is because, well, the field of people who knew enough about aircraft was rather small. So being able to pick these people out from the population and centralize them in a location so that they work either together or while apart, still in the same area, and share their ideas and communicate with each other was a rather powerful tool. So the AEA, which I believe was based in Canada, was actually formed by Mr. Graham Bell, and there was a lot of funding actually provided by his wife. She was independently wealthy, as far as I understand it, and had donated a large sum of money so that they and the other members of the AEA could work on said projects. Now, the dirigible work and other creations by Mr. Curtiss would help propel him as a leading aeronautical company in the United States, or at least one of the leading aeronautical companies. Um, One of the earliest successes of Curtiss and his group. Here we can see his earlier work on motorcycles and the dirigible that he actually worked on with Mr. Baldwin. You can see on the bottom right here, this is actually an ad for Curtiss motorcycles, which kind of gives you a sense of his business acumen, where he clearly knows a selling point when he has one. Now, again, when it comes to the earlier successes of Curtiss, one of the biggest ones was the JN Trainer, or Jenny as it was affectionately called, with almost 7,000 being built over its entire lifetime. The vast majority of these were produced from 1915 to 1920, although we'll be able to get further into the JN Trainer story in a later episode. But it gives you an idea as to how um, how wide a net he had cast, and just sort of the benefits that he was able to reap from that. A contract of 7,000 aircraft is significant in such an early period of time. I believe it outnumbers. I as a curiosity, I think it outnumbers the total number that the Germans ever had in terms of aircraft in World War One. I might be wrong, but in any case, 7,000 is a huge number. Now, if we fast forward 20 years, Curtiss merges with the Wright Company of the Wright brothers fame, of course. They survived the Great Depression, and they maintain some steady contacts and contracts with the U.S. military. There's numerous aircraft that also held the Helldiver moniker. Reusing names is a common theme, depending on which company we're talking about, uh, just because I guess originality never really worked. And some names, admittedly, are just kind of cool to have around. Now, as with the previous episode where we talked about the oh my god, I'm blanking on it. The ferry Fulmar. Certain companies there's a very good reason for a military to fund a company such as Curtiss Wright, among others, of course, so that they stay in business, even despite the Great Depression and other things going on. Namely, it's a knowledge base that you do not want to lose in the event that something was to happen. Now, when it comes to Curtiss and I guess Curtiss Wright, that's the sort of thing that you fall into, is that you want to keep them around because, well, things actually are starting to heat up in certain parts of the world after the Great Depression, and as companies seem to be pulling themselves back together. And so,
Plus,
oh, sorry, what?
Curtiss. Plus, Curtiss seems to be having a pretty good record of success. I mean, they make the
Mm-hmm.
P-35, which is the biggest single order, I think, peacetime order for planes for the U.S. Might be the biggest single order for the U.S. period, by that point in time, and just they've got a lot of planes in a lot of places.
Yeah. So the Curtiss company doesn't need a bailout, so to speak, but it's kept afloat because of the constant infusion of cash and obviously the designs that Curtiss is able to provide the military. Now, in 1938, the U.S. Navy realizes that it needs a new dive bomber. So it releases a specification for it that Curtiss, along with Brewster, and I believe one or two other companies, give prototypes and give specifications or return specifications for the request. Now, the specification itself says that they are looking for a cantilever monoplane design using stressed skin, so duralumin, that sort of thing, having an internal weapons bay, which is kind of for a dive bomber is special, and I guess we'll be able to see why further along. The weapons bay has to be able to carry a 1,000-pound bomb, as well as a wide array of other munitions, because obviously it's not going to only perform one duty, and having it be able to multitask is always important. The bomb bays itself must be hydraulically opened. The wings have to be of a folding type, and there needs to be a crew of two. It was stressed that the for dive bombing, it had to absolutely be capable of that, as well as being carrier capable. Being in the U.S. Navy, obviously they wanted it on their large boats. Now,
Also, checking in about what time is this happening? Because if I remember right, that's going to be during the kind of when the SBD was getting going and taking over for the biplanes, right?
yes, so this would be about 30 late 38. 1939. There's no clear date as to when exactly Curtiss returned specifications for the Helldiver, or what would become the Helldiver, but that's what they were working with. Um, on top of the dive bombing, carrier capable, folding wings, hydraulic bomb bay doors, the requirement also stated that it had to be small enough so that two of the aircraft could fit on a 40-foot by 48-foot aircraft carrier elevator, with a foot to spare all around for clearance. Now, um, there's not too many photos out there that show Helldivers, much less a pair of Helldivers on an elevator. There should be one later on that we'll get to see. But it should be stressed that 40 feet by 48 feet is not a lot of space in terms of planes.
Yeah,
Now,
it's short,
yes,
actually.
it is a compact space, and it should be noted that other aircraft of the type didn't necessarily have those same restriction placed on them. For example, the SBD never had that restriction. It was designed to for a certain job with the capacity to carry a certain bomb load, and so on and so forth. So the last spec, aka the size restraint, is the major source of consternation for the Curtiss design. An internal bomb bay of 1,000 pounds requires a large body. As we can see with the first prototype here, the Sb2c-1, it is a very chunky plane. It has a large body. It's very reminiscent of the size you'd see on a TBF Avenger, or in terms of aircraft, if you're looking for fighters, P-47 has like the same sort of rugged design that just is huge in comparison to, say, a Spitfire or a 109.
Yeah. Do you note that the TBF got away with a lot more length? That thing was 40 feet to the Helldiver's 36.7.
Yeah,
That makes a difference.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to talk about the Avenger further in the future. So despite the limitations of the specification itself, the design, I'm led to believe it's by a Raymond Blaylock and Don Berlin. Information on them seems to be a little sparse. I believe they both have Wikipedia pages, which is more than a couple of other people that have been mentioned in previous episodes. But essentially, the design comes together as what's seen on the screen. Originally set to have a fully enclosed and powered turret, that was dropped by the Bureau of Aeronautics, BUAir, rather than BUOR, when they reviewed the full-size mock-up. So, as you might imagine from designs, the company would bring a half-size, maybe full-size. It kind of depends on company and time and how much money they have to work with. But they'll bring up a mock-up, and the company or the military looks at it, reflects on what they want to see on the design and what might want to be removed, so on and so forth. So they nixed the turret on the rear of the plane, and during wind tunnel tests, it became clear that the modifications would be required. Both the stall and dive speeds were excessive. There were just problems with the aeronautical profile of the aircraft. Despite these early warning signs, the military went ahead and put in an order for 370 examples anyways. So not only were they serious about getting a new aircraft for the dive bombing purpose, but they didn't really have much else to go with. Brewster's design never really made it anywhere, and that kind of gets flushed down the toilet, basically.
Yeah, it's a Brewster, and well, Brewster has a reputation, and the SB2A was one of the ways they earned it. Among other things they wound up cutting was the powered turret, the rear cockpit entirely and a bunch of other things, and it just still didn't fly well.
Hmm. I don't
Just
believe that Brewster really earned uh, a lot of goodwill after the Brewster Buffalo didn't really perform all that well in certain areas of the world at the time either.
it didn't perform that well, and also they had genuine issues with delivering planes.
Hmm.
Brewster was terribly run as a company. They had continual labor problems, and like to the point where there was potentially sabotage of plane components or carrier
That's that's nuts.
landing gear.
I
There
can't
was
wait
not
to
much goodwill.
I can't wait to read more on that for future episodes. Um, for the Helldiver itself, on the 18th of December, 1940, it flies for the first time. It has a Wright twin cyclone. Curtiss Wright, their company, generally speaking, the aircraft are named Curtiss, and the engines will be called Wright. I believe it's just the way that um, both companies were prioritized before their merger, and they sort of just kept that going for the foreseeable future. Um,
Yeah, the companies before the merger became de facto divisions after.
yeah. So the Twin Cyclone has a three-bladed propeller. The unfortunately the engine itself suffers a lot of teething problems, and the propeller also has a lot of work that gets done to it. Um, but unfortunately, not. It's kind of modifications to the propeller, but nothing in depth, like, or at least nothing that I know of that is in depth in terms of changing its specific profile and how wide it is and all that. Well, there's changes, but not nearly as much as might be seen on the Helldiver's frame or the engine itself. So, unfortunately, the flights that it performs display the same sort of issues that they had in the wind tunnels or wind tunnel tests. Basically, there's a lot of stability issues with the plane itself. And unfortunately, in February, with than a month of testing done. So, yes, December to February is obviously more than a month, but having the time and input, whether it's flying time, wind tunnels, etc. They had less than a month to actually work on the plane. The Cyclone engine dies on final approach, and the crash for the plane, although not fatal, so the pilot thankfully walks away, stalls the project by 3 months because they need to effectively rebuild the airframe and they didn't have a second one on hand. As far as I'm aware, they weren't even building a second airframe. They were just, I guess, hoping that nothing bad would happen. Um, as testing resumes in early May, the aircraft crashes on its 10th flight from a landing gear collapse. So, not exactly the same issue, but in the same general area of problems.
Yeah,
The,
carrier aircraft, weak landing gear.
yeah, oops. This sort of brings some more issues to the project as a whole. Modifications come in August, and the there's uh, flights and changes made by the designers all the way up until December 21st, 1941. So an entire year's passed. The aircraft is still being tested, much less put into any sort of production. Um, so on December 21st, the aircraft gets tested for dive and spin characteristics. While pulling out of a terminal dive, both the wing and tail break. Now, once more, the pilot is able to successfully bail out, counts his lucky stars, but it means once more that the project has no flying examples of the aircraft. As you can imagine, a broken wing and a tail and a dive, it's basically a total loss for the airframe. Now, if we can see a little bit of the different modifications that were brought in. Unfortunately, getting some photos, it's impossible to get a side by side of the actual planes. because obviously they're the same plane in before the crash that eventually destroyed it. But we can see a couple things, namely, in order to try and reduce the stability issues experienced, we can see that the tail development of the first tail versus the second one is an immense change. The tail, it's they don't give any exact figures on how big the tail became, but just this side by side and in the Sb2C Helldiver in action book, it clearly shows there's a massive difference between the two, um, and it kind of fixes a couple things. Couple other things too is the nose development. We can see that on the original propeller versus the rebuilt one has what's called cuffs on the propeller, and they sort of exist to help generate more airflow into the engine. I'm not entirely sure how it works, other than I suppose having a thicker cord or thicker overall size so it can swoop more air into the engine intake. That's about all
Maybe
I
a
can really come up with.
gradation in the angle of incidence potentially.
Hmm.
Um, oh, about the tail, that's got a lot to do with just how short the darn thing was, because it's a leverage. It's a matter of leverage. You know, give it a
Right.
longer lever and you need less push, but it's got a really short lever, so it needs a lot of push at
Yeah.
that point. It's kind of like what the P-51 grew, where it had a kind of vertical tail when it had a razorback, and then they cut the rear deck down for the bubble canopy, and they needed a bit more tail area, so they made kind of a stair step approach to the thing to
Hmm.
it. Like
Right.
if you see how the XSB2C-1 goes straight into the tail, while the rebuilt one kind of curves gradually up into the tail and starts way earlier.
Right.
Right, right, right there.
There we go. For the lovely viewers. Yeah. So another little change is the fact that the original design had two 30 cal machine guns in the basically in the front of the cowling that shoot through the propeller hub. These get changed and moved to the wings. Um, there's a few other things that is more noticeable in later examples, as we'll see. Take note of the gun sight here, which is actually just a telescope. It's more visible in over here. We can see the actual one kind of juts out the right side of the aircraft, and that gets quickly removed. But
Yeah, they weren't using reflex sights in 1940. That's
no,
interesting.
it's actually so near the
Yeah,
start of World War II and slightly before, there was a real big interest in telescopic sights rather than reflex sights. I'm not exactly sure why there was such an appeal for it, but yeah, you can see it on a lot of planes of that specific era. Um, it's
probably a
interesting in and of itself, really.
probably a focus on trying to shoot for specific points and potentially trying to get a little bit more range out of gun
Hmm,
installations.
that would make sense,
Which is
yeah.
weird because the fighter pilots are busy practicing deflection shots, and basically the only people in the world doing that before the war starts. But they switched over to reflex sights pretty quickly and comprehensively around the start of the war.
Hmm. I can't
So
imagine
why that sound?
how annoying it must have been to also use a telescopic sight while you're flying around in the air as
Oh God, it's
it,
bad enough when you've got a rifle that the telescope is attached to that you can put your head in the same place every time, let alone getting bounced around in a plane. Good grief.
yeah, for sure. Um, so this I found really interesting. It's actually I found it in the manual, the Pilot and the Beast, I believe it's called. I think I had the reference at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, but basically it gives a very nice, succinct definition of what propeller pitch is. I myself had a slightly different um, mindset of what it was, but this kind of gives it. So, for anybody who may not be interested in actually reading the paragraph, basically all it's saying is that electric, it means that the propeller is operated by an electric motor. No, it is not rotated by an electric motor. It's still the engine that does that. It is rotated by the engine, the Wright R2600 Cyclone, but the pitch of the blades is changed by an electric motor contained in the power unit housed in the spinner. The pitch of the blades is the angle the blades make with a lawn drawing perpendicular to the line of flight. The greater the propeller pitch, the faster you fly. That is, within limits, because the blades take a bigger bite, quote unquote, of air on each revolution. Another related item you may file and forget is the bigger the bite taken, the harder the engine must work. So it's very interesting because it also comes into play, or is also kind of very similar to what feathering a prop is, which is to basically rotate the angle of pitch of the propeller blades so that they create less drag. So generally speaking, you'd only feather a prop on a dead engine that can't be used anymore. But it's very interesting because I've never seen a diagram in a manual before for to explain this sort of phenomena. So actually have it is really interesting.
Basically, the thing for feathering is that if you have prop pitch, the oncoming air is going to push the propeller in one direction. It's going to windmill the propeller,
Right.
basically spinning it with the oncoming wind, turning energy from the oncoming wind into rotational energy, which is then basically wasted, and it's incredibly draggy.
Mm-hmm. It's actually really interesting because if you ever see a plane that loses power in one of its engines, if it has multiple anyways, and you see it windmilling, yeah, it can't feather its props. So something to keep in mind.
Or it's trying to use it as an impromptu brake.
I suppose, yeah, that as well. Um, so getting back to the Helldiver itself, after the crash on December 21st, we can fast forward safely to June 1942 when the first Sb2c-1 Helldiver rolls off the production line in Columbus. Now, with regards to Curtiss, they were having some issues actually being able to fulfill orders. They were getting more orders than what they could produce I believe they had 2 or 3 manufacturing plants. I always forget. My apologies in advance. But they had also subcontracted out to the Canadian Car and Foundry Company, and I believe one other one in Canada as well. The name is escaping me, and I don't know why. Anyways, so the basically an order instead of 370, the U.S. Navy decides it wants 4,000 planes. 1,000 of these were planned to be produced in Canada, again specifically with the Canadian Car and Foundry, although another one was used as well. And to give a sort of idea as to the tumultuous beginnings of the Sb2C were, the first 14 built are immediately taken to the side and tested and trialed. Nothing, they never go to units. It is a we need to fix the problems with these planes, and we don't have the time to build a prototype, work on it a little bit, send it back to the office, and so on and so forth. Now, the first aircraft had problems, namely the design as it stood, at least in terms of the prototype, didn't account for certain changes that would be required in a sort of combat aircraft. It's a little strange to think about because Curtiss had other aircraft that were at the time involved in the conflict, that being World War II. But also they were a company that should have been accustomed to that. So the problems that were experienced was there were 4 major ones. The first being that the Helldiver in production had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It had no DF loop, or directional finding loop, or radar, depending on how you want to look at it. there was no aircrew armor, and there were major differences between the lightweight magnesium forgings that they used versus the aluminum castings that were used in actual production. So when you
Direction finding also for carrier planes to come on home.
Yes. So DF loops are actually very important for any sort of aircraft that operates with boats because it's your way to point you back home. Um, uh, I guess a small brief tangent, or at least as brief as I can make it, would be that the DF loop sort of you use it to get a bearing on where you need to go, because when you're in the briefing room, getting the details of your flight that you're going to perform in the Pacific, or I guess technically Atlantic and wherever else, you're basically given the final waypoint to meet up with the aircraft carrier at its designated position in X hour time. So if your mission takes 2 hours, then you do your patrols on the waypoints that are projected that you're told to go to, and at the heights and the speeds and so on. And then on that last waypoint, you basically look at your flight plan and go, okay, I need to be heading at 65 degrees for say like 300 miles. So at the end of that 300-mile trek at 40 degrees, you are supposed to be in the area in which your aircraft carrier would be. If you don't find your aircraft carrier, you're in some trouble. Now, radio obviously helps, and if you're not under radio silence, then it's not as big a deal, but it becomes a very important thing to keep in mind, and why DF loops are critical at that specific point in time in terms of aeronautics.
Yeah, even with the benefit of all of that, they lost a dive bomber squadron off the Hornet at Midway.
Yeah,
An
and
entire squadron just flew off, didn't find the Japanese, flew back, didn't find the Americans, crashed. May as well have all been shot down.
mhm.
Oof.
And it's one of those things that just ends up being a waste of airframes. And considering how desperate some portions of the U.S. military were to get some of these aircraft, not to mention other nations and getting their aircraft as well, those aren't losses that you can ever really afford. It also really sucks when you've been training these people for X number of months, if not years, and they all go out. They never really you don't get a recoup on the time and money invested in these people, and it's something that is probably obvious, but being lost at sea, you generally don't have the highest of percentages in terms of survival rate. If you're lucky, you'll get rescued rather soon, but there's many tales of airmen or Navy personnel of on boats that tragically never make it home just due to not being found sooner. Um, for the Helldiver, getting into production and into a production format rather than just being in prototypes means that with all the inclusions, the self-sealing fuel tanks, etc., the total weight of the plane jumps by 3,000 pounds, and the top speed is reduced by 46 miles per hour. Um, Predictably, you can safely assume that its range, its climb rate, its surface ceiling, all of these things are also naturally affected just by the additional weight and the engine not really producing more power in order to compensate. A couple other changes were effectuated, namely that there was a revision on the propeller. Again, the exhaust stubs of the engine itself are modified. It should be in one of the next few images we see. The cowl guns are moved to the wings, so they are no longer 30 cals and the cowling. Everything becomes 50 cal machine guns, as well as the rear gunner. Instead of having a twin gun set up in the rear that is 30 cal, it now changes to a 50 cal machine gun. Just a solitary one, Um, Not entirely sure why they decided to make the change, but it is changed nonetheless.
That one
Um,
bounced back and forth, and I honestly have no idea why. It might be a reaction to war experience.
I think it definitely came down to preference at a certain point. In any case, it never really mattered all that much just because 30 cal and 50 cal were such popular cartridges in the US military as a whole that it never led to really supply issues. So, as long as they had it and it was approved for a particular aircraft or use, then there was never really any issue with swapping one out for the other. Um,
Plus, against Japanese planes, there wasn't much worry of armor being able to stop a 30, but not a 50.
yeah. Um, so on top of that, additionally, we'll see that there's another change here that we can see. But mainly the 50 cal guns is what it goes into with production the first time around. It's actually kind of hard to spot the twin 50s, but I should be able to point it out in a future photo. A couple other things to point out is that there's going to be an interchanging designation of the SB2C, namely the SBW and the SBF. Both the SBW and SBF are the Canadian named versions of the SB2C, and they all follow the same -1 designation. And further on in other variants, they'll follow the same
That's
number.
really weird because usually the W manufacturer code is for no, W is consolidated, say, and F is for Grumman.
So that's the thing, is that because it was Canadian and they didn't drop
Yeah, they're
the SB, they didn't drop the designation of the plane itself. They were able to keep the like they just standardized on those two. Um, Fairchild Aircraft Limited in Canada. That's what it was. So
yeah,
so the F designated SBs are Fairchild and W is Car and Foundry. That's what it
yeah.
was. Um, so
F is weird there. That that annoys me.
well,
And
there's
I
actually
actually understand the U.S. Naval Designation Scheme, but there was a Grumman prototype scout bomber. It was a biplane, and it kind of sucked, but
it's actually going to bring me into a mention. I should probably actually mention it here, just because it's kind of annoying. I forget if I have the page on my good monitor though. I don't believe I do. Damn. Basically, the tangent revolves around block numbers. So if you ever see, um, you won't really see it with the SB2C. Thankfully, generally that information is kind of hidden to the side and not really talked about. But you see block numbers a lot with the P51, the B17, the B24, etc., etc. A block number is just a sort of general designation for when a major jump in variant is occurs. So if there's a lot of changes to a plane, generally what they'll do is that unless there's a lot of aircraft that are produced in the interim, they will usually. So let's say the SB2C has a block number of 10, because they always do multiple of fives in terms of major variants. So if for whatever reason we're at SB2C-1 block 10 with its serial number and so on and so forth, but if it's in block 10 and there's a couple changes, like they make some modifications to the landing gear or the changes to the wing profile, well, that might now, if when it goes to the when it's being produced in the factories, that might be called block 11. But if there's major changes, so not just like a little bit of the wing profile and whatnot, there's a huge change to the airframe or just a lot of smaller changes incorporated into one new design, they might call that a block 15, and so on and so forth. So if you're ever confused about block numbers, there's only like one website on the entire internet that talks about it. It's really annoying because that sort of thing kept me up at night for long periods of time trying to figure out what exactly those block numbers ever meant. Um, Anyways, getting back to the Helldiver, all these small changes, the self-sealing fuel tanks and so on, changing the machine guns from the 50 cal or replacing the 30 cals and so on and so forth. They eventually would add armored glass to the pilot, or for the pilot, so he's not at as much at risk. The telescopic sight gets replaced by a reflector gun sight. The aircraft gets bomb racks and what are called Yagi antenna, basically implement for radar on the plane. All these extra modifications just mentioned give the appellation of the Sb2c-1 Mod 1. The mod versions aren't really talked about all that much. Essentially, what you need to know is that if the Sb2c-1 is a Mod 1, all of these changes, the bulletproof armor and or bulletproof glass and so on, those are modifications that were done in the field. They would eventually make it into the production lines, but the first numbers of them, those are modifications that only happen in the field. Now, a second production line eventually gets put in place, not because they want to produce more planes, or not specifically, and not because they're trying to boost their production, but because of these changes that they're trying to effectuate, they they effectively have planes rolling off of one production line to go into another, so that changes are applied to those planes that just left the factory, so that they can now be up to code. So the second set of modifications, called the Mod 2, it ends up being elongated into a list of 800 things that they've changed with the overall design. Um, by now we've reached mid-April 1943, and they're still effectuating large changes to the overall design itself.
Incidentally, it was supposed to sail out with the USS Essex in March 1943, but
yeah, it was destined for to be on the Yorktown. It was destined for action earlier than 1943, and the changes that were required, the amount of time that pilots had to work with them was just never enough to comfortably seat them in that position. So summer of 1943, another change is made, resulting in the Sb2c-1 Mod 3, which basically just reverts the twin cal machine guns on the Helldiver, or goes back from the 50 cal to the 30 cal guns. Again, this ends up being preference. You see the same sort of changes on the SBD Dauntless, where they kind of change from 30 cals to 50 cal to 30 cals again. And so it doesn't really make it clearly is a preference thing of the Navy, and they're trying to work with what experience that they're getting in the field. Here we have a nice comparison of the Sp2c-1 Helldiver. So keep in mind, this is one of the first variants of the Sp2c versus the SBD 6th Dauntless, effectively the last variant of the Dauntless. And the reason why I'm showing the two side by side is because it gives you a good idea as to the differences both planes have. The SBD is the aircraft that came before the Helldiver. Everybody in the Navy liked the Dauntless. Um, it came to be known as the slow but deadly, kind of referring to its speed, but the lovable and sort of the lovable attribute that they have for they appreciated its flight characteristics, and the fact that it can carry such a large payload kind of also gives you an idea as to what they thought of it. So we can see that the size for the Dauntless is a lot smaller, 8 feet less in terms of wingspan, almost 3 feet less in terms of overall length. The height is a little tricky because some people refer to the height as a level aircraft with gear extended, whereas other people see the total height as the aircraft on the ground on its gear, so in that 30-degree angle type view. But generally speaking, the Helldiver is larger than the SBD in that regard as well. And despite all these issues, despite the fact that the Helldiver is a solid 3,600 pounds more empty weight than the Dauntless, it can still outspeed it. Range as well, but the range calculations kind of get a little weird, so you can't always really base arguments on that. There's differences between ferry range and combat range and so on and so forth, but still important to compare the two. Afterwards, we've got a couple photos here so we can see a couple things. Namely, this is a 50 cal armed gun. It's really close to the landing gear doors, which is what makes it really hard to see. Additionally, we can see the same thing over on this side. They just pop out in the sun on this aircraft carrier. We can see the Yagi antenna. A lot of aircraft had this at the time in the US arsenal, the bomb racks as well. And we can kind of see a little bit on the exhaust stub that would exist or be modified a couple times with regards to the Navy planes. Additionally, this gun has the twin cal, whereas this one has the single barrel 50 cal. And there's a small change here to the pitot tube, which basically helps give you your speed and a couple other indicators. And it received a bent pitot tube, but the earlier versions had a single tube. Also interesting to note is that much like the BF-109, the Sb2c Helldiver actually had operated slats. And these slats that would extend, in the Sp2c Helldiver, they extend automatically when the gear is down. So this is why it's popped out here, but not necessarily on this plane in the bottom right. In this photo, we can just see it's popped out. But otherwise, you don't really get a good indication. But the idea basically is to slightly increase the wing profile so that you can get a little bit more lift. It basically just helps with some anti-stall properties. Whereas, say, like the BF-109 used it, and it was more driven by how did it go? It's like hydraulically operated, but based on like angle of attack, I believe. In any case, we'll get to the 109 at some point, but the important part is just that it helps generate a little bit more lift. There's a rather interesting story with the various markings that we can see on the tail. Sadly, I believe just with the amount of time that this episode is taking and how much else I have to cover, it's probably a topic for a later date, but the idea is that the tail markings are generally recognition markings for which carrier the aircraft belonged to. This should not be confused with the double, I should probably take a different color, with the double marking over here. The double marking is actually just a notification or a visual aid for carrier flight deck crew so they can kind of help a pilot adjust their angle of approach when trying to land on an aircraft carrier. Because when they're looking at the aircraft, they'll see the two hash marks or the hash marks on the tail, and if depending on what the angle is, they can kind of they can help out the pilot if they need to raise or lower their nose. Here's just another interesting part of aircraft flying and performance. It's a really good tip, or it's a good idea, or it is a great instruction on how to ditch an aircraft. If you've ever watched movies that involve planes, and especially if they're over water, that kind of helps for this, anyways. But you'll typically see these sorts of you'll see maybe a scene of a plane crashing in the ocean, and it gives you the the basic training as to how to perform such a landing and try not to get yourself killed at the same time. Any sort of aircraft that hits water has a very high chance of flipping over, depending on its size and speed, of course. Um, so the idea here is basically you're trying to not pull up your nose until the last possible moment. So if you happen to find yourself in a flight simulator or whatnot, and you don't want your virtual pixel man to perish, as we will put it, um, make sure to keep your speed as low as possible and only nose up at the very last possible moment so that you don't gain any altitude. Also,
You want to
it
fly the plane into the water rather than stall the plane into the water, basically.
right,
I know it sounds scary flying the plane into the water, but one of those things is that a flying plane still is generating lift. And you want
hmm
to make your sink rate as low as possible, among other things.
right,
And a stalling plane tends to drop its nose abruptly, so if you pull your nose up way too far, bleed speed, and then stall, you're likely to have your nose come down, catch, and flip you. It's bad.
right.
Don't do
And, and obviously, for a manual such as the Pilot and the Beast, which is what these two snippets come from, it's very important for pilots because when you're trying to extract yourself from a plane that is sinking in the ocean, you might not have all the time in the world. And if you're already pointing upwards, you're starting on a high note, basically. Um, this other snippet is actually really cool. I didn't realize that this was actually a thing in specifically for the SB2C. I don't know too many other dive bombers that employ this, but frankly, it's not really a topic that ever really gets discussed like ever. So to learn about this sort of thing was cool. Again, for the listeners, it basically the manual says, "Have you noticed that little weight on the bottom of the control stick? At one point in time, the SB2C had a window in front of the stick through which you could have seen it. Now, if you have the desire to look, you'll have to crawl under and look up through the bomb bay. That little weight is there to help prevent you from pulling too many G's. As you might imagine, a dive bomber, you don't want to over G because it stresses the airframe and leads to, say, your wing or tail ripping off." Excuse me. Here we can see a nice little photo on an aircraft carrier with one of our Helldivers. Sadly, I can't find any photos of two on a single elevator, but this should probably give you a good idea as to the amount of space that would have been available to it. If you try to have, well, if you try to have two side by side, let's say it ends about here. In terms of line drawn, yeah,
You're
you're
probably
really
going to be putting them one facing forwards, one facing backwards, which sucks for the deck crew to turn around.
yes. So it's not you can easily tell how cumbersome it is to have a hell diver having two of them, and why it would have probably been a much better thing to design it in a way that, yeah, maybe you have to settle them horizontal, but you can get a bigger airframe. You can have a lot, well, just an easier time at designing this entire thing. Um, Unfortunately, with this photo, I think it's a little hard to tell. I think there might be two guns here. But in any case, tough to see. If this is a barrel, this would basically let you know it's a 50 cal version, so probably a mod 2. But in any case, the getting back to the Helldiver on aircraft carrier performance, as mentioned prior, the Helldiver did not make it into combat as soon as it probably could have, and the one of the major problems was that the pilots did not have enough time to work with the Helldiver in order to finalize carrier trials. So there were just too many losses. There were too many issues with the design, and pilots were unfamiliar with it to that degree. Um, when you're trained with the SBD Dauntless, the flying characteristics are very different from the Helldiver, at least from all the mentions that I've seen elsewhere. So there's obviously going to be teething problems, and they were just the U.S. Navy needed planes that they could work with and not have to worry about if they could recuperate it for another strike once the first one had returned. So they canceled, quote unquote, the use of SB2Cs until they could get the program or training for the aircraft at a more desirable level. Um, Notably, I could not find a longer quote, unfortunately, but essentially the Yorktown's captain, basically, I believe this is the Yorktown, but the Yorktown's captain, J.J. Clark, suggested that the Helldiver program should be scrapped. And while I can't confirm this, the one book that talks about it says that Sb2c Helldivers should be converted as anchors due to their increased weight, the general lack of um, performance, we'll say, which kind of gives you an idea as to what the general opinion of the SB2C was. One thing to also keep fresh in people's minds when it comes to dive bombers is that the Helldiver was sort of a new breed in the sense that it was getting a very powerful engine in a very compact design, and you can obviously see that there are going to be aeronautic challenges with regards to this. The P-51 experienced this. The P-38 also experienced this, and what I'm referring to is compressibility. Now, I'm not smart enough to fully grasp the method in which to explain compressibility, and that's why I have the entire page, or at least the meat and potatoes of compressibility via NASA's own website. So if you're interested in compressibility and seeing the longer form data on it, I highly suggest that you check out the link as seen at the top of the page. The only way I can really express it myself in layman's terms, is that think of when you jump into a pool, and the faster you jump into a pool, rather than just like dip your toes in and walk in, but when you jump into a pool, you're going at a high speed and you're capturing a lot of air that then follows down with you to a certain level. Eventually the speed reduces and the air bubbles go back up to the surface, as their buoyancy is wont to do. And compressibility follows a similar sort of interaction. It's obviously not the same thing, but think of compressibility as the air bubbles that are clinging to you and effectively modify your overall form that that you that you exist as within the liquid of water. So for compressibility, how it works is that air molecules, or the property of gas or gaseous molecules, contract onto the airframe and form an extra layer, and that layer affects the aerodynamic capacity of the object that it is now stuck to. So
that's got to do with the speed of sound is the speed of sound because air basically can only move so fast. And if you get air clinging to the control surfaces don't work just by angling down or angling up. They work because they're pushing air down or pushing air up, and you have upward or downward force on the tail, which turns the whole plane.
Right.
If it's not pushing air up, it's not pushing the tail down, and it's not turning the plane.
Right. And so what ended up being discovered um, is that you would have aircraft such as the I believe it's the A26. What's it called?
20
The P-51
Apache.
A36 Apache. Yes. So you have the A36 Apache, the P-38 when it was being used as a dive bomber, very rare. Um, But those aircraft, along with the Helldiver, were basically experiencing the near Mach speed effect on their different control surfaces. And what that meant was that you would suddenly not be able to pull yourself out of a dive. Now, I believe for the A36 Apache, this was a notable problem and led to quite a few deaths. I believe in Italy, P-38, same sort of idea. Not as many accidents, I don't believe, but I think they experienced the issues of compressibility with the P-38 a little bit sooner just because of its higher speed and general use. The Apache was very, very uh, rarely used in combat. So, all to say,
P-38 was the first as well. So they had all
right.
sorts of fun with that. They thought it was elevator flutter, so they wound up putting weights on the tail planes that they never removed, and all sorts of other things until they finally sorted out dive brakes that worked.
Yeah. So all to say that it wasn't a rare problem, so to speak, for the US military. Sadly, I don't know of any other documentation in other nations about the same sort of compressibility problems. But I think that relates maybe more to other nations not exactly having the same sort of engine power and just general designs and um, experimentation that the U.S. was doing at the time. I could be wrong, but when you look at just dive bombing in general, if you look at the Germans, they've got the Ju-87. That's basically it. There's a couple other designs, sure, but for the most part, you're looking at the Ju-87, maybe the Ju-88, but by 43 and 44, you're not really seeing it all that much. The Russians had the PE-2, not much else in terms of dive bombing, and the PE-2 isn't exactly a powerhouse in speed. You might have a couple of D3As, some D4Ys in the Japanese inventory. The
The
D4Y didn't.
D7Y, I think, was their attempt at a Helldiver equivalent. That one took forever, so it might have had issues.
The D4Y had problems. The D3A was it never had speed, so it would have never experienced the same problems. Um, you don't really have much else in terms of dive bomber designs on that end. The Italians never had anything that really worked, period. So not much to really discuss on that end. And the British as well didn't really have anything in the dive bombing category. So you can kind of see why nobody else really talked about compressibility. It just wasn't really a thing in those nations. And so you end up with just the US discovering an entirely new phenomenon that they now have to design around. Um, so, anyways, that's compressibility. Next, we can move on to the Army version of the SB2C.
Plus, with that side view, there's another reason I think the U.S. Ran into a decently large number of compressibility issues, and that's just because they tended to build their fighters big,
Yeah.
their light planes big, because they had big engines and they can fit more stuff and they wind up doing so.
Hmm.
And also, their power plant installations tended to be big, powerful.
and and not only that, but you also just have the general weight of US aircraft being higher, which means in a dive you're accumulating speed that much faster. um so here we have the A25. It's called the A25 Strike, so Shrike, and basically it is a Sb2c Helldiver, which with a couple of things removed. Of note, you can generally see this on Army aircraft. The exhaust stub is longer than naval aircraft, um, and there's no DF loop in an Army aircraft because you're not really fighting over a featureless ocean. The wing did not fold, so that was another change. Is that these never moved up, um, and that's some of the major changes between the two. Um, Effectively what happened was the Army took an interest in the Sb2c Helldiver program as it was developing in 1940 and 41. They were still sort of enamored, or the story goes anyways, that they're still sort of enamored by the Ju-87 Stuka and its performances in combat. A lot of a lot of nations followed suit. They had the same sort of idea of, oh my god, the Stuka is a wonder weapon. It's fantastic. And by 1943, everybody realizes, like, oh, actually, the Stuka kind of sucks. And the only way for it to be good is for it to be in an environment in which nothing really poses a threat to it. Which, I mean, that doesn't really make a weapon crappy, but it certainly takes a couple of the sprinkles off of the turd, so to speak. Um, so by 1943-ish, late 1942, but 1943, the Army is getting some A25s, uh, and they request a couple changes of their own. Now, these changes are in most part minor. As mentioned, the wings don't fold. There's no DF loop, etc. Those things aren't the biggest deal. The earliest, the A25s still kept the folding wings, but those were changed eventually. But one of the, I guess, biggest changes is that the Army really wanted bigger wheels. I'm not entirely sure why. I believe it was for better clearance in muddy terrain, as one might expect, because you're landing on the ground and not an aircraft carrier. The ground changes depending on season and where you're at. Um, and so, to alleviate any sort of interchangeability or production issues, the Navy actually says, hey, you know what? If the Army wants it, we will also take the increased wheel size as long as it does not impact our own production. And this became a legitimate concern because Curtiss was eventually ordered by the U.S. Army to swap over their St. Louis factory to A25 production. So anything you're producing, stop it. You now have a 3,000 plane order by the U.S. Army that says, start giving us planes. We need them now. Um, the first of these was supposed to come off the line on 29 of September 1942. I don't believe the dates quite matched up just due to issues with getting a new factory changed over and so on. But by mid-late 1943, as mentioned before, the dive bomber concept in terms of for the Army is more of a liability than any sort of major success and outbreak that they had hoped for. Again, stuff like the Stuka, the D3A, well, the D3A is kind of a category of its own, but the Stuka, the BE2, like these things don't really work out. The U.S. Army has been also experimenting with the P-38, the A-36, and there's just nothing that really justifies their use. So, after 900 examples have been built and shipped to the Army cancels its interest and says, hey, we don't want these anymore. Hey, Navy, you guys still want some? Have it. We don't care for them anymore. So what ends up happening is the Shrikes go back to the factory, and sometimes in the field they get modified, but they go back to the factory in general, get all of the U.S. Navy equipment put back on, and then get used in various capacities. Now, the modification, or if any of them were kept in their original configuration with the Army, these are generally seen as Sp2ac or Sp2c Dash A 1A, A being Army, of course. And in sort of I guess if you want to look at it, sort of timeless example of people, the U.S. Army, and I guess more specifically the U.S. Navy's opinion of the Marines, they kind of just said, "Hey, you guys want planes? Have some Helldivers. You'll enjoy them. We're sure of it." And so the Marines end up with a bunch of Helldivers, and they never really do anything with them. Most, if not all, of the A25s or subsequent Helldivers in that group that made it to the Marines are used for training purposes only, and a lot of them end up getting kept in continental US, if not shipped back there, and end up performing more training and target towing duties. There were attempts to get the Helldiver into acceptance elsewhere. The British were sent some. They were curious about it. They received, I believe, 28. Never worked. They hated the design and quickly gave it back to the Canadians. The Australians at the time of 1941, they had expressed some interest in it. Obviously, 1941, 1942, they're under a lot more pressure than they had initially imagined, especially if we're looking at 1939, 1940. So they expressed some interest in it, hoping that they might get a good design. The US sends over, I believe, between 6 and 12. I forget how many exactly. But the Australians get some. They also hate it. They don't really they don't see a purpose for it. And they get it in, say, late 1943. I think they get some. And much like the U.S. Army, they say, yeah, we don't really need dive bombers really anymore. We'll pass. Thank you very much. And I believe the ones that were sent to Australia get shipped back to the Marines so they can use them. So kind of just to give you an idea, like it's not really working out for the Sb2c at the moment. Here we can see there's two different aircraft. Generally speaking, the Sp2c would have gone, its next variation would have been the Dash 2. Sadly, no Dash 2 has ever existed except for, I believe, a select 2 airframes. And they were used as a seaplane bomber. Sometimes fighter, sometimes bomber. It's not very clear as to what specifically its role would have been, just because of it was canceled at a certain point. The basic idea is that in 1942 and some early stages of 1943, there was a appreciation, I guess we'll call it, for Japanese seaplanes. Most notably, they had the A6M2-N roof. I forget how it's called, or how it's pronounced.
It's the roof.
But basically, this one is an M6A Seiran, but both of them are kind of served a similar purpose. Now, the Seiran was more bombing or reconnaissance, whereas the A6M2 was more of a fighter. But the point still remains: the M6 was created at a later date, so we'll have more. We'll have better performance that we can see with these two tables interchanged. Effectively, what happened was because the U.S. Navy was infatuated with the idea of a seaplane fighter that can project the power and control far away areas that may not have access to an airfield or aircraft carrier, the Sb2c-2 was supposed to fill in that gap, and basically help with power projection and controlling areas. Now, in order to do this, because the Sb2c was a very large aircraft and had a lot of weight to it, the design focused on two mounts. There were a couple tested. Most of any reference will point to the Edo mount, so EDO. And we can see that the Sb2c2 carried its own uh, like a new fin on the underside in order to give it a little bit better stability.
Yeah, that's needed because of the floats. You see the same thing on the F4F derivative, the Wild Fish Cat, which was as good an idea as it was a name,
Mhm.
and no ironic jokes don't count. That was a terrible name.
um, so yeah, the one of the main issues with the SB2C2 was just that it had a it was its takeoff run on water was considered too long, and honestly, by the time that the SB2C2 gets out of like development, or not even out of development, but while it's still being developed in April 1944, keep in mind this is a project that started in 1942, but by 1944, there's the US has 70 plus aircraft carriers, I believe, or is producing up to 72 or 70 aircraft carriers. There's no more need for a seaplane fighter.
I
This
think they
invent
literally have more escort carriers than they do ATOLs that would make sense as a float plane base.
Yeah, exactly. And when you can also have your CBs do amazing work and effectively just like carpet an area into an airfield in maybe a couple of weeks at most, you don't really have a need for an aircraft that can, while appreciated that it can land anywhere in the water, anyways, it kind of just doesn't hold importance after a while. So it was quietly shuttered. April 1944. It just doesn't make a notice. It never gets noticed afterwards. Um, Again, with regards to the SB2C2, it's very hard to find any sort of stats. The two, well, I was going to say two decisive books. There's one book that's dedicated to Curtiss, and I think it's not that great, but there's one book that's amazing. It covers as much as you can expect without having an entire litany, like a cabinet full of reference papers, but nobody really has much in terms of design specs for the SB2C2. Suffice to say that even the M6A in 1944/45 is only generating about 300 miles per hour as a top speed. That's with the floats attached. It's got it while it has a similar bomb load as what might be expected on the SB2C2. It doesn't. That aircraft does not have the bomb bay doors that can open anymore, thanks to the struts. So these struts are going to prevent the bomb bay doors from opening. So if there's any modifications, it might only be on the wings. They might have to just strap a bomb right in the middle and hope for the best. Um, so its capability to even carry ordnance is severely reduced when compared to even one of its closer opponents. So it kind of gives you an idea as to the problems that one might expect in a seaplane. So further, we have the Sp2c-1C, which is basically it is the same as an Sb2c1, except it now has 20 millimeter cannons. So they drop the 50 cal armament in the front. They swap them out for 20 millimeter guns. There's not I haven't seen any comments that say whether or not that was a good move. But honestly, having such powerful forward firing munitions, it's helpful. I'm sure. Um,
From what I remember, roughly speaking, 220s for 450s is a reasonably even weight of fire trade-off.
hmm,
Because the are firing a considerably heavier shell.
right.
Plus, add in explosive effects. I could see it being useful for suppressing things during a bit more useful for suppressing things during a dive than 50s.
Hmm. I've seen arguments go both ways where having four 50 cal guns means you can suppress a larger area, whereas the 20 millimeter cannons, if you manage to hit what you're aiming at, you're going to suppress it I don't want to say better, but having, like you said, the explosive compound and how much bigger those shells are. It's definitely going to be a plus for that sort of armament. One of the other big changes is there's now hydraulic assistance for the flaps. Um, there's only about 778 of the Dash 1Cs that ever get built. Um, the 1C is technically the first design, the first Helldiver design that gets built in Canada. So it kind of gives you an idea as to production capacity. Um, and 1944, when things finally start to, when the outlook for the Helldiver looks a little bit better, that's when things start improving, and the performance of the Helldiver after being in actual combat scenarios really shows or instills a confidence in crews that use them that uh, it's probably going to be a better aircraft than the SPD Dauntless. Not to take away from that itself, as the Helldiver would never ever be able to get the same sort of handling characteristics than the Dauntless, but gives you an idea as to sometimes being able to dodge a plane isn't better than surviving it altogether.
Yeah.
Another small thing I'd like to add is that this bomb is, as far as I'm aware, a 1,600-pound bomb, uh, and you don't really see it all that often. So it's very nice that there's a photographic evidence of this. But the only way to get because the bomb bay was originally designed for a 1,000-pound bomb, to get the 1,600-pound bomb, they had to actually take the doors off. There's no other way to get that bomb inside the bomb bay. So you also see this sort of modification, although in a slightly different variation, with the torpedo. The torpedo required the bomb bay doors to be removed, and there was a special mount for the torpedo to go on in order to get not only clearance from the bomb bay, but also to get the proper angle so that when you're launching it, it enters the water in the correct angle of attack. For the Sb2c dash one or yeah dash 1C, we can see that it gets a couple changes. It's not all that much, namely the increase in engine power. There's a couple changes with weight, very very minor. There's some very slight changes in overall size. It generally keeps its overall size. Maximum speed goes up, the range decreases a little bit, surface ceiling improves with the better engine. And we can also see that this baby, while performing some air to ground missions, actually has twin pods. We don't see the other one that would be on this side, but it carries two pods, and each pod had 50 cal guns. So if this was a 50 cal armed Sb2C, it would be carrying 8 50 cal machine guns. In this case, it is 250 or 450s and 220s, which is a rather powerful assortment. We can also see just the two barrels sticking out, and you kind of see the two guns in the rear here. This I just really like seeing. It's a page in one of the manuals, I believe for the Sb2c-3, that basically talks about what it can carry and all the different configurations. So, like with the BA65 and technically the BA64 before it, gives you a really good idea as to what you should expect, and what kind of missions it can perform. So when it comes to the Sp2c3 and 4, there's a couple differences, but you can read through this. The main idea is that you've got a lot of different bombs, cluster munitions, different arrangements, both on internally in the bomb bay and on the wing racks as well here at the bottom. And kind of just an idea, like, for example, the torpedo, which is specifically mentioned for having an adapter for it. the 1,600-pound bomb does not have a mention for the bomb bay because, again, it's just removing the doors.
It should be the fuselage bomb loads. I think that does fit in the doors. It's the 2000 that they mentioned using the torpedo adapter. Might be
I, f-
external.
I feel like the 1,600 was external and the 2,000 was external with an adapter, but I could be wrong on that. You might be right.
Yeah,
Um,
I think the aircraft characteristics page had the empty weight reduced for the torpedo because it has the doors removed, but no other.
oh,
And
yeah.
it doesn't list the 2000. So
I'd have to, I guess I could double check. But
that's a weird one, and I don't know how far to trust those figures because it, for some reason it has the 1,600-pound bomb listed as the range with the 1,600-pound bomb listed as longer than with the 1,000-pound bomb, and I haven't figured out the reason for that.
I wonder if so because they would close the because it uses an adapter to not be in the bomb bay. I'm curious if they used an extra like droppable fuel tank that would be in the front portion of the bomb bay, which you can see in some of the cutaways. I believe in one of the earlier slides there's a cutaway for it. Maybe that might be it. Um, Otherwise, I don't really know why they would have such a difference in range. Um, Getting away from the Sp2c2 and the 1C, you have effectively the Sb2c Dash 3, which is um, for all intents and purposes the major design in terms of Helldivers. If there's Helldivers, if there's a most common version, it will be the Dash 3 with I believe the Dash 4 coming right after. But regardless, the Dash 3 has one of the more important developments added to the aircraft. Um, it has the uprated engine at 1900 horsepower, which we saw in the 2 slides ago. It's got a new four-bladed propeller, so it ditches the three blades. It also receives the perforated dive brakes, which we can see right now. It gets a modification to allow it to use a different airborne radar, specifically the AN/APS-4. And that would, if using that radar, it replaces the Yagi antennas. Um, and to I believe unfortunately it's not the way I'm taking photos is not exactly the best, so a little curvature here, but this should be straight obviously, but kind of gives you a really good idea as to the various differences that you see between the earlier development of the dive flaps versus the when they finally properly understood compressibility. This is what they came up with. You can see the same change on SBDs at a certain point. I forget exactly which variant the change happens, but once we talk about the Dauntless in its own episode, I will definitely be making a point to talk about that. One of the things to keep in mind as well, not only does this help at least with compressibility issues, but the profile that these holes, especially all the additional holes, provide just makes it better in terms of dive performance. And also, as a small measure, helps cut down on weight. So you can see it being a two different bonuses at the same time, which is always nice. Despite the new dive breaks, despite all these sorts of all these changes that have now been included, um, it's pretty clear that mid 1944 to towards the end, the dive bomber itself as a concept is already being overshadowed. Not only is the SBD falling out of the public limelight, the Helldiver never really has enough in terms of actions in order to even build that sort of mythic um, uh, propaganda, I guess if you want to call it that sort
Plus,
of.
if you really want to dive and bomb the F4, you can do that actually surprisingly well.
Well, that's the
Uh,
thing, right? You typically see a lot of SBDs in popular culture. I guess Midway, as the one of the more recent movies that came out, is a really good example. The SBD kind of was able to fill that niche that the Helldiver just never really had the opportunity to. Um, Not to say that that Japan didn't have as many boats, or that the boats weren't as um, important or useful to their, I guess, overall strategy, whatever you want to call it. But most of the actions that the U.S. Seems to talk about, or at least makes reference in popular culture, tends to focus on the first 2 years of the war. And so anything that shows up in that time frame is popularized, or becomes infamous, depending on its current standing
yeah.
at the
By the
time.
end of the war, we kind of treat sinking Japanese ships as a fait accompli, which is interesting considering you get things like, Helldivers and stuff taking on the Musashi and the Yamato and so on and so forth. And I mean, in fairness, it's just such a large number of the things that there's no real iconic stuff. It's just, oh, hey, there's the big blue blob of deletion coming by, and all the really fondly remembered stuff that gets remembered as keeping the fleet safe is the fighters holding off Japanese planes. So the
Yeah,
Corsair
yeah.
and the Hellcat are what get remembered.
Hmm. So here we see two different Sb2c Dash 4s. Um, we can see here, obviously, the four-bladed propeller becomes really important. Um, you have, while not necessarily easily visible on this example, we can see the zero-length rocket launcher rails, so called because they're two stubs. They don't actually have a rail between them. So if you see, you see it a lot more with um, Russian aircraft and British aircraft to an extent, where they have rails between all of their stubs, which the entire purpose is that it allows the rocket to develop speed and spin, so that when it's in flight, it ends up being a little bit more accurate. Accuracy in terms of rockets, especially in the 1940s, is not exactly a something that a lot of people praise, because they weren't accurate, really. It's more for large area suppression, or if you're shooting at a big target, something you hopefully will hit. Now,
Yeah.
we can also see that the both of these aircraft are sporting the different radar, the AN/APS-4. The profile is obviously different, and they no longer have any sort of Yagi antennas attached to them. One other very small change that kind of gives you a really good idea if the Helldiver was ever modified, or is a late production Helldiver, whether it's I believe Dash threes, the late ones got it as well, or were retrofitted. The Dash fours definitely got it. The Dash fives, as we'll talk about later, definitely got it. The essentially what they did was they made it so that the arrestor hook was always extended. So in normally how it operates is that it's, say, a hook at nearer the tail end of the aircraft. It's got its stub, and when you're getting close to landing, the pilot flips a switch and it pushes the hook out so that it can catch a wire. They eventually just decided there's not much of a point to even have the hydraulics invested in it, and just have it always in an extended position.
I
Um,
think part of that is part of a extended weight reduction campaign, because if you notice, the tail wheel is down as well.
yeah.
I believe that was a change that got made during production. And also, if you look at the nose, the propeller spinner has been replaced with a really minimalist hub,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
again was an attempt to claw back a little bit of performance by cutting weight wherever they could.
Yeah, any small improvement was seen as worthwhile. So, as mentioned, the profile of the tail wheel actually changes a couple of times, but in its final version, it's always in the down position. There's no point to have all of the hydraulic lines and so on. It's kind of over engineering to when really, if you're losing, say, 3 miles per hour over the wheel sticking out, you might actually gain 3 miles per hour if you're cutting weight in unnecessary locations. Like an arrestor hook is not generating enough drag to ever really matter all that much, and so eliminating even just the wiring and the hydraulics, which means you're carrying less hydraulic fuel and so on and so forth, just makes it better. Even if it's a small improvement, it's still better. One of the other big changes that you can notice on Sb2c-4s and more, I guess more specifically fives, just because they're you see them more that way. But the dash fours and fives, um, if they're late production, especially, they should have a no frame canopy. So the pilot just has really good lateral and vertical view. Not necessarily towards the front, but side and up is really good. This is the Dash 5, I believe. So the last production you'll ever see. Again, it might not, I forget. But anyways, point is that you see again the framing of the cockpit is really good, offers a lot of visibility. The rear gunner kind of gets stiff still on it, but
Yeah,
um,
geez, navigator jail.
you still see some of the other changes that you have with that, namely the tail wheel, the extended hook, the AN APS-4 radar, um, propeller hub being pretty naked here, and so on and so forth. Um, this is basically the culmination of the Sb2c-5. The Dash 5, basically the biggest change it gets is increased internal fuel capacity. As mentioned before, the cockpit framing changes, but the Sb2c-4 sees those cockpits. So whatever. The main change generally is seen to have happened on the 5. Now, um, despite the 5 being terminated in the sense that the Sp2c-5 barely made it into the national inventory by the time that hostilities ceased. I believe 3 or 4 months. I forget specifically, but it still made 970 airframes produced. So there's still a large number of aircraft, especially when the total number of aircraft is around 7,000. But this page is basically to give you an idea as to why exactly no dive bomber exists after the war. Why?
February 1945 for the SB2C-5 entering
Gotcha.
service, and there's 970 of them and 85 of the Canadian Foundry.
Right. Yeah.
So,
So before the
or
end of
no,
the war,
Fairchild? Just W. I forget.
W is Current Foundry.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, so basically, like a couple months before the end of the war in Europe, 6 months before the end of the war in Japan, gives you an idea as to how all of these stack up. These are basically the final variants of each of these major designs. So the SBD6, the F4U4, and the F6F-5 Hellcat. These are the final versions, and we can see here that the Helldiver boasts a medium powered engine. It's not the strongest, but it's definitely not the weakest by a large margin. It weighs more than every one of its competitors, whether that is empty or gross weight. Um, the wingspan on it is huge. We can see the overall size difference, really. The F4U, the F6F, even the SBD, they generally fit in the same sort of box, but the Helldiver sticks out like a sore thumb. The average speed you have of, or maximum speed, I should say, cruising speeds as well in terms of average speed, just make it so that your fighter aircraft is the new normal. It can carry more bombs and more rockets, in general, helped by the fact that it's smaller, so it doesn't weigh as much, and with a higher power engine, means that it just has the ability to carry more further and still retain its combat capabilities if it needs to perform in that capacity after it's dropped munitions, or even before munitions it dumps its weaponry, whatever, and goes into dogfight mode. um, so
Plus, the Corsair in particular, I know had a dive brake mode for its landing gear, where it has basically fairing plates. The landing gear retracts backwards, and there's a covering plate. You put that down, and it blocks airflow a bit, such that the Corsair itself can actually dive bomb relatively decently.
yeah, in a limited capacity, it performs what the Helldiver does, and it takes a crew less, and it's just the
And
it.
having seen the Helldiver's list of restrictions on flight modes, good grief. I'm not sure Helldiver didn't do what it did in a limited capacity.
Yeah, the really, if there's a takeaway from this, I hope that you, the viewer, come off it with the idea that the dive bomber as a concept and as a weapon of war was something that could be considered successful between 1936 and 1943 tops. And anything after that or before that either did not have the ability in terms of the airframe design, the stress limitations on material, or general know-how on developing such a weapon, and after 1943, just the overall competitiveness of other aircraft, even if they're not in the same design category as a dive bomber, outperforms a dive bomber. Your F4U and your F6F don't need to have flying escort if they so choose, or if they are nominated or made to perform ground attack duties. So
By the end of the war, the Navy is actually asking for rear seaters to be left out of light bombers because they're convinced that the extra speed is more than worth the defensive addition of the tail gunner, especially considering that they can be reasonably assumed to be escorting their strikes. And actually, one of the funnier ones is some of the later ones where they're actually comparing the similar weights of a jet engine and a tail gunner, both of which mainly get used while they're near the target.
right.
Yeah, and speed comes out ahead. And honestly, the up till 43 for dive bombers, the Stukas and some other planes fared pretty poorly before that, like the Army's Dauntlesses in the Philippines, which I mentioned in a previous episode. To some degree, dive bombers worked great until they got intercepted.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Um, so the Helldiver planned to have one other version after the Dash 5. The prototype being named the XSB2C Dash 6. It was planned to give it a newer engine, specifically the Wright R 2600 22 Cyclone, rated at 2100 horsepower. And it's said in the books that it had quote unquote significant improvements to its performance versus the Dash 5. There are modifications to the dimensions in several areas of the aircraft as well, namely, or at least in terms of the photo we have, we can see that the tail profile is completely different.
Yeah, it got longer.
And just shorter in general. The wingtips, there's only like this photo and one other one, which makes it awkward. But we can also kind of see the wing is it's stubbier. It's shorter and stubbier. It's hard to really see it in this photo. I believe we can see that the canopy in the middle is kind of more raised than the framework, so it kind of suggests like more of a bubble canopy style. attachment, but suffice to say that
Maybe.
the Dash 6 never it never even entered. It was never assumed to get an order because by the time it could have made any sort of impact, the hostilities had ceased.
Yeah,
Um,
it was ordered on the 9th of February 44 and flown on August 1945, which is just why bother?
yeah, and as mentioned, dive bombers as a concept go away, and jet aircraft become the next level that people are now chasing after. Um, the
And there's
XSB.
still some level of piston planes. There's stuff like the Douglas AD and the Martin AM, which
Hmm,
are both large, powered by the B-29s R2800, I want to say. Uh, Big, fast, capable single seaters, and they're huge.
hmm.
They carry a ton.
We're actually going to see. I believe it's the next episode. Is the next episode or the one after that? I forget. We're actually going to see a lovely turboprop plane in the next one, so that'll be interesting and shows that while the age has definitely um, leapt forward in great leaps and bounds, you still really should not take away from propeller-driven aircraft. They still have many uses in various capacities throughout the world. Um, the SB3C, just to sort of finalize things as we're getting near the end, basically this was a prototype only that was designed um, in the possible eventuality that the SB2C did not become a success. There's a couple changes. The tail has a slightly different profile, I believe. Um, the we can see that the basically the propeller spinner was going to be different, much larger. It already adopted four props, four blades on its prop, and I think the armament was going to be slightly different as well. Um, the other changes was that it was going to have a massive increase in speed, namely a R3350-8 Wright engine, which is rated at 2300 horsepower. We can see that it has a tricycle landing gear, which that would have been interesting in a carrier environment in 1940s. Um, and what else?
Yeah, I think that was partially intended as a basically building the successor to the plane while the current thing is under development, which wasn't particularly uncommon,
Yeah. Uh,
especially when things were getting when things were improving very rapidly. And also when Curtiss was taking an inordinate amount of time with their projects due to the fact that they had too many projects.
um, yeah, the only notes I have really mention that Navy has the SB2C. They don't really want to try with the SB3C. The SB2C is already enough of a problem as is, and the Army has absolutely no interest. Um, and so the XSB3C just kind of gets canceled and shuffled to the side. Um,
Yeah, the Douglas design for that is the XSB2D, which becomes the AD, and the XSB3C wasn't that bad. It was considered, but it would have needed higher grade fuel, which was a real pain to handle on aircraft carriers, and
yes.
it, it was just not up to par with the Douglas design. So the Navy cut that as kind of like the third best option they had.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a liability with regards to the different fuel type. Just because your different octanes is not something that you're not going to build an entirely new fuel tank in an aircraft carrier just to because you need to fuel one specific aircraft that all the
Plus,
other planes don't.
I think there's potential issues with the additives.
Oh,
Right.
probably. I'm not entirely sure on that, but that does make sense.
Yeah.
Here we just have a couple of the surviving SB2Cs. I believe these are both Dash 5s, or I, maybe this one is a Dash 4 and that one's a Dash 5. Regardless, um, the SB2C was shipped off to numerous different countries. There was some mention previously to the ones during the war, namely the British and Australians. They were both planning to get some, but both just said no. We don't like these, and just kind of politely declined them. The Greeks received some SB2C5s as part of surplus from Navy stocks. Um, these were used on communists in the country during the Greek Civil War. The French used them for a number of years, them as well during an uprising, or namely the independence of Vietnam, that was being fought over there. Um, Portugal is said to have received some in some sales. Not much is really known about the Portugal ones. They didn't really they're used in the inventory. Not much else to really say, I guess. Uh, Italy receives some, and Thailand as well also gets a number of the aircraft. Um, I believe this one is a Greek one, and this one is a Thai version. So
Yeah,
there's
that'd be correct for the tie at least.
yeah, there's still a few still hanging around. They mostly I've seen of all the ones I've seen, they typically have the darker um, camouflage on them. Not entirely sure why, because I don't. I guess they would only be relegated to night combat, but that also doesn't really make so much sense. That aside, this is the in a way evolution of the variants of the Sb2C. So first and foremost, we have the overall design Sb2c Helldiver, of course. We have the different prototypes and what these variants eventually led to. Um, there's a majority, or at least a solid third of entire production is devoted to the Sb2c-1 and its subvariants. Um, the British received the 28, manufactured by Carn Foundry. They were named Helldiver 1, as was typical of British standards in terms of naming, and then given right back. So they're not counted as additional production. That's why they have no number. Otherwise, Sp2ca where 1A is basically the same, and these kind of go back and forth. So no mention of special numbers is really required. The Canon version 778 built, and then we can see the Sp2c-3, and the 4 is basically an offshoot. It's not really. There was never an Sb2c-4. You might consider, I guess, one or the two that was pulled off way earlier and then given those changes, but I wouldn't ever really classify it as its own prototype. So um, the only other difference I want to point out is that we have two versions here, with the E designation added to the end. The E designation is basically the aircraft, but with an AN APS-4 equipped, radar on it. Or sorry, yes, the APS-4.
It's
There's another
interesting.
one. There's another one added on the SB5, the ASB radar, or a different. Anyways, point is that the E has a different radar, so it gets, if you ever see it, people will call it that different variant, but otherwise it's not. They don't have specific production numbers themselves. They're just modifications. And as always, page is left intentionally blank, as all military manuals should have that page. Couple of important sources. Axis and Allies Paintworks, really useful. They had a page that has a plethora of Sb2c Helldiver photos. So if you're ever interested, I highly suggest checking that out. A lot of the higher quality scans slash photos are taken directly from that. Um, and I've seen a lot of those photos published in different works. Um, the did I not add it? Oh man, I feel like a jerk now. Where do I have that book? I'll have to go looking for it real soon. There's a lot of these are interesting or useful as always. Avia logs. I don't want to plug them too much because I'm not getting paid, but giving me access to the original manuals, specifically Pilot and Beast, which is one of the manual that the company actually produced and circulated so that people could get a better opinion of the SB2C, which I thought was really funny. Um, the One of these books is also super terrible. So flip a coin on which one. It's unfortunate because these books are rare and expensive. Um,
Oh no.
yeah, it's one of those. It's the books that kind of just there's limited production run and so on. I actually have it here. This one is bad, so don't buy this one. Martin Charlton, I'm sorry to say, but I don't like your production. Compared to Mr. Bauer's book, Charlton just does not have as much information, whether it is on uh, the various contributions Mr. Curtiss had, or all the different variants, experimental planes, and just does not have nearly as much data on the variants. Whereas Curtiss Aircraft by Peter M. Bowers, really good book. Honestly, if you want to know anything about a Curtiss Aircraft, I would highly suggest that as being a source for the interested user.
How do you cover Curtiss aircraft, especially including the World War II years, without having decent coverage of prototypes? That's the only thing they did.
Well, I mean, in Mr. Bauer's case, it's 652 pages or so.
Yeah, yeah, sounds
Um,
about right.
and with Mr. Charlton's, it is 129.
Yeah, okay, I
So
can see that difference.
it gives you an idea as to how much effort. Well, I shouldn't say effort because that's kind of insulting. There's a lot of it's really hard to get sources and go to different companies and get all this information. But
Oh, absolutely. It's just, I mean,
suffice to say, Christmas is coming up soon. So if you have a book that you want to get and you're choosing between Curtiss Aircraft 1907 to 1947 by Peter Bowers and Curtiss Company Profile, same years by Martin Charlton, get the Bowers book, please.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, as far as experimentals go, Curtiss had an insane
a
number
lot,
of
a lot to
airplane
work with.
projects going. Like so many that I would normally be tempted to say, hey, let me give greater context at the end of the episode and run down. And I'm looking at this list and I'm looking at how long this episode's been going already, and I'm thinking, heck, you want to just spin off a bonus?
Oh, trust me, there when I say that this podcast is about military aviation and various combat aircraft, we are going if I will probably die before we ever complete this project as I would like it intended. But definitely we are going to cover a bonus episode would be fun to talk about various projects. And I think is the way that we'll need to go for um I guess we'll call it Wunderwaffe or whatever stupid name that Nazis like to give to dumb projects that the Germans had in specifically in World War II. But whatever. Basically,
USN 46 is awesome and has all sorts of cool and interesting tools. What are you talking about?
um, but yeah, there's definitely going to be videos that are more collections of aircraft. And that will be mentioned obviously in their various descriptions because I mean we can talk at length about the Helldiver because it was a produced aircraft that had a lot of variants, but an experimental aircraft might only be a side note in a book that is overly expensive and hard to find.
Yeah.
So I feel
I've
like
got pretty good coverage of the US one, so I wouldn't mind doing a US companies that ran themselves into the ground, and here's what the planes they were working on while they failed looked like for
yeah.
Curtiss Rooster.
Yeah, we'll definitely be doing videos on that, and I think the best way to do it will be to separate by company, just so that if there's anything we missed on earlier conversations about those companies, we'll get to them. But with regards to the Helldiver episode, I'm just gonna take 2 seconds to get my other two books that, for whatever reason, I did not add to the sources.
Oh, here, I may as well give you the one that I tend to work from,
All right.
facilitating my
So the other two
context
books.
giving, I mean massive dilettantism.
What did I just walk into? Um, there are two books here, very useful. It's a very interesting collection. It's called the In Action Collection. So if you're ever interested in a specific model and there's an in action about it, they're generally worthwhile. Some of the I'd say the first 20 books or so kind of lackluster depending on what you're looking for, but otherwise they're stellar products. Sb2c Helldiver in Action, aircraft number 54, by, there's no author on the front page, by Robert Stern, is a it's a very good book. Has a lot more info on some of the origins of the Helldiver than the follow up, which is Sb2c Helldiver in Action. I know, very interesting, or very diverse names, but this one is number 235, I believe, and written by David Doyle. So if you ever get your hands on some of these books, In Action is actually really good. That is the end of my plugs for these books because, again, they're not paying me, sadly. Speaking of paying, I hate doing this, so I'm just going to do this begrudgingly and save it for the end while most people have already left. If you'd like to contribute to our Patreon, check us out at Flights of Fancy podcast on Patreon. And if you have ideas or any sort of questions, interests, whatever you may have with regards to the concept of the show, send me a message on at Fancy Podcast on Twitter, and I'll see if I can either respond or yeah, just take it as it is.
And my main source has largely been U.S. Experimental and Prototype Aircraft Project Fighters 1939 to 1945 by Bill Norton, which is a solid book. It's a few hundred pages, and it goes through a refreshingly broad idea of what a fighter constitutes. Basically anything with one engine or an air-to-air combat mission. So, like, carrier strike planes get included, but the A-20 doesn't, for example. So,
Right.
like, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, and other weird stuff. And it goes through basically every project of the war, and including some brief bits on the stuff that was still in service, but very old and very bad.
Nice. Well, I'm definitely going to have to take a look at that and add that to my collection.
Yeah.
As always,
And that's really what the Patreon money's going towards. It's dropping $40 on a book for one episode and stuff.
or just supporting projects. I'd actually, if we got a lot of money out of it, not that I'm thinking we do, but if we ever had any excess cash, I think it'd be a really good idea to dump that towards restoration projects or groups so that they can either get planes back into display condition, and I mean, it'd be awesome if any of them got them to flyable conditions, but that might just be a pipe dream for some of the different vehicles that we'll see as the podcast moves on. As for my closing remarks, I'd just like to say once more, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and Mr. X, if you got anything else, take it away.
Nope, not right now. Seriously though, part part of the reason why Curtiss had such a hard time with this thing was because their plate was ludicrously overfilled, and it's just goofy how many things they were working on.
All right then. Um, I'm just gonna double check my spreadsheet here real quick. So for anybody who's made it this far, the next episode will be on the Embraer Tucano, or otherwise known as the Toucan, produced by Brazil. So
Oh, neat.
we'll we can finally get away from the son of bitch second class, or the Sb2C, as most people hated it, and get into a turboprop aircraft. So until then, take care.
Have a good one.